Hello and welcome back to Detective and Mystery Fiction. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. The Bronze Door by Raymond Chandler. Chapter 1. The little man was from the Calabar coast, or from Papua or Tongatabu, some such remote place like that. An empire builder frayed at the temples, thin and yellow, and slightly drunk at the club bar. And he was wearing a faded school tie he had probably kept year after year in a tin box, so the centipedes wouldn't eat it. Mr. Sutton Cornish didn't know him, at least not then, but he knew the tie because it was his own school tie. So he spoke to the man timidly, and the man talked to him, being a little drunk and not knowing anybody. They had drinks and talked of the old school in that peculiar remote way the English have, without even exchanging names, but quite friendly underneath. It was a big thrill for Mr. Sutton Cornish because nobody ever talked to him at the club except the servants. He was too defeated, too ingrowing, and you don't have to talk to people in London clubs. That's what they're for. Mr. Sutton Cornish got home to tea a little thick-tongued for the first time in 15 years. He sat there blankly in the upstairs drawing room, holding his cup of tepid tea and going over the man's face in his mind, making it younger and chubbier, a face that would go over an Eton collar or under a school cricket cap. Suddenly he got it and chuckled. That was something he hadn't done in a good few years either. "Llewellyn, my dear," he said. "Llewellyn minor. Had an elder brother. Killed in the war, in the horse artillery." Mrs. Sutton Cornish stared at him bleakly across the heavily embroidered tea cozy. Her chestnut-colored eyes were dull with disdain, dried-out chestnuts, not fresh ones. The rest of her large face looked gray. The late October afternoon was gray, and the heavy, full-bottomed, monogrammed curtains across the windows. Even the ancestors on the walls were gray, all except the bad one, the general. The chuckle died in Mr. Sutton Cornish's throat. The long gray stare took care of that. Then he shivered a little, and as he wasn't very steady, his hand jerked. He emptied his tea on the rug, almost delicately, cup and all. "Oh, rot," he said thickly. "Sorry, me dear. Missed me trousers, though. Awfully sorry, me dear." For a full minute Mrs. Sutton Cornish made only the sound of a large woman breathing. Then suddenly things began to tinkle on her, to tinkle and rustle and squeak. She was full of quaint noises like a haunted house, but Mr. Sutton Cornish shuddered because he knew she was trembling with rage. "Ah-h-h," she breathed out very, very slowly after a long time in her firing squad manner. "Ah-h-h. Intoxicated, James?" Something stirred suddenly at her feet. Teddy, the Pomeranian, stopped snoring and lifted his head and smelled blood. He let out a short snapping bark, merely a ranging shot, and waddled to his feet. His protuberant brown eyes stared malignantly at Mr. Sutton Cornish. "I'd better ring the bell, my dear," Mr. Sutton Cornish said humbly, and stood up. "Hadn't I?" She didn't answer him. She spoke to Teddy instead, softly, a sort of doughy softness, with something sadistic in it. "Teddy," she said softly, "look at that man. Look at that man, Teddy." Mr. Sutton Cornish said thickly, "Now don't let him snap at me, my dear. Don't let him snap at me, please, my dear." No answer. Teddy braced himself and leered. Mr. Sutton Cornish tore his eyes away and looked up at the bad ancestor, the general. The general wore a scarlet coat with a diagonal blue sash across it, rather like a bar sinister. He had the whiny complexion generals used to have in his day. He had a lot of very fruity-looking decorations and a bold stare, the stare of an unrepentant sinner. The general was no violet. He had broken up more homes than he had fought duels, and he had fought more duels than he had won battles, and he had won plenty of battles. Looking up at the bold-veined face, Mr. Sutton Cornish braced himself, leaned down and took a small triangular sandwich from the tea table. "Here, Teddy," he gulped. "Catch, boy, catch." He threw the sandwich. It fell in front of Teddy's little brown paws. Teddy snuffled it languidly and yawned. He had his meals served to him on china, not thrown at him. He sidled innocently over to the edge of the rug and suddenly pounced on it, snarling. "At table, James," Mrs. Sutton Cornish said slowly and dreadfully. Mr. Sutton Cornish stood on his teacup. It broke into thin, light slivers of fine china. He shuddered again. But now was the time. He started quickly toward the bell. Teddy let him get almost there, still pretending to worry the fringe of the rug. Then he spit out a piece of fringe and charged low and soundlessly, his small feet like feathers in the nap of the rug. Mr. Sutton Cornish was just reaching for the bell. Small bright teeth tore rapidly and expertly at a pearl-gray spat. Mr. Sutton Cornish yelped, pivoted swiftly, and kicked. His neat shoe flashed in the gray light. A silky brown object sailed through the air and landed gobbling. Then there was a quite indescribable stillness in the room, like the silence in the innermost room of a cold storage warehouse at midnight. Teddy whimpered once, artfully, crept along the floor with his body close to it, crept under Mrs. Sutton Cornish's chair. Her purplish-brown skirts moved, and Teddy's face emerged slowly, framed in silk, the face of a nasty old woman with a shawl over her head. "Caught me off balance," Mr. Sutton Cornish mumbled, leaning against the mantelpiece. "Didn't mean, never intended." Mrs. Sutton Cornish rose. She rose with the air of gathering a retinue about her. Her voice was the cold bleat of a foghorn on an icy river. "Chinverley," she said. "I shall leave at once for Chinverley. At once. This hour. Drunk, filthily drunk in the middle of the afternoon. Kicking little inoffensive animals. Vile, utterly vile. Open the door." Mr. Sutton Cornish staggered across the room and opened the door. She went out. Teddy trotted beside her, on the side away from Mr. Sutton Cornish, and for once he didn't try to trip her in the doorway. Outside she turned slowly as a liner turns. "James," she said, "have you anything to say to me?" He giggled from pure nervous strain. She looked at him horribly, turned again, said over her shoulder, "This is the end, James, the end of our marriage." Mr. Sutton Cornish said appallingly, "Goodness, my dear, are we married?" She started to turn again, but didn't. A sound like somebody being strangled in a dungeon came from her. Then she went on. The door of the room hung open like a paralyzed mouth. Mr. Sutton Cornish stood just inside it, listening. He didn't move until he heard steps on the floor above, heavy steps, hers. He sighed and looked down at his torn spat. Then he crept downstairs, into his long, narrow study beside the entrance hall, and got at the whiskey. He hardly noticed the sounds of departure. Luggage being descended, voices, the throbbing of the big car out in front, voices, the last bark from Teddy's iron old throat. The house grew utterly silent. The furniture waited with its tongue in its cheek. Outside the lamps were lit in a light fog. Taxis hooted along the wet street. The fire died low in the grate. Mr. Sutton Cornish stood in front of it, swaying a little, looking at his long gray face in the wall mirror. "Take a little stroll," he whispered wryly. "You and me, never was anyone else, was there?" He sneaked out into the hall without Collins, the butler, hearing him. He got his scarf and overcoat and hat on, grasped his stick and gloves, let himself out silently into the dusk. He stood a little while at the bottom of the steps and looked up at the house. No. 14 Grinling Crescent. His father's house, his grandfather's house, his great-grandfather's house. All he had left. The rest was hers. Even the clothes he wore, the money in his bank account. But the house was still his, at least in name. 4 white steps, as spotless as the souls of virgins, leading up to an apple-green, deep-paneled door, painted as things used to be painted long ago in the age of leisure. It had a brass knocker and a thumb latch above the handle and one of those bells you twisted, instead of pushing or pulling them, and it rang just on the other side of the door rather ridiculously. If you were not used to it. He turned and looked across the street at the little railed-in park always kept locked, where on sunny days the small, prim children of Grinling Crescent walked along the smooth paths, around the little ornamental lake, beside rhododendron bushes, holding the hands of their nursemaids. He looked at all this a little wanly, then he squared his thin shoulders and marched off into the dusk, thinking of Nairobi and Papua and Tongatabu. Thinking of the man in the faded school tie who would go back there presently, wherever it was he came from, and lie awake in the jungle, thinking of London. Chapter 2. "Keb, sir?" Mr. Sutton Cornish halted, stood on the edge of the curb and stared. The voice came from above, one of those wind-husked, beery voices you don't hear very often anymore. It came from the driver's seat of a hansom cab. The hansom cab had come out of the darkness, sliding oilily along the street on high rubber-tired wheels, the horse's hoofs making a slow, even clop-clop that Mr. Sutton Cornish hadn't noticed until the driver called down to him. It looked real enough. The horse had time-worn black blinkers and the characteristic well-fed and yet somehow dilapidated look that cab horses used to have. The half-doors of the hansom were folded back, and Mr. Sutton Cornish could see the quilted gray upholstery inside. The long reins were riddled with cracks, and following them upward, he saw the beefy driver, the wide-brimmed coachman's topper he wore, the huge buttons on the upper part of his greatcoat, and the well-worn blanket that swathed the lower part of him round and round. He held his long whip lightly and delicately, as a hansom driver should hold his whip. The trouble was that there weren't any more hansom cabs. Mr. Sutton Cornish gulped, slipped a glove off and reached out to touch the wheel. It was cold, very solid, wet with the muddy slime of the city streets. "Doubt if I've ever seen one of these since the war," he said out loud very steadily. "What war, governor?" Mr. Sutton Cornish started. He touched the wheel again. Then he smiled, slowly and carefully drew his glove on again. "I'm getting in," he said. "Steady there, Prince," the driver wheezed. The horse switched his long tail contemptuously, telling him to be steady. Mr. Sutton Cornish climbed in over the wheel, rather clumsily, because one had lost the knack of that art these many years. He closed the half-doors around in front of him, leaned back against the seat in the pleasant harness-room smell. The trap opened over his head, and the driver's large nose and alcoholic eyes made an improbable picture in the opening, like a deep-sea fish staring you down through the glass wall of an aquarium. "Where to, governor?" "Well, Soho." It was the most foreign place he could think of for a hansom cab to go to. The cabman's eyes stared down at him. "Won't like it there, governor. Too many Dagos." "I don't have to like it," Mr. Sutton Cornish said bitterly. The cabman stared down at him a little longer. "Yus," he said. "Soho. Wardour Street like, right you are, governor." The trap slammed shut, the whip flicked delicately beside the horse's right ear, and motion came to the hansom cab. Mr. Sutton Cornish sat perfectly still, his scarf tight around his thin neck and his stick between his knees and his gloved hands clasped on the crook of the stick. He stared mutely out into the mist, like an admiral on the bridge. The horse clop-clop out of Grinling Crescent, through Belgrave Square, over to Whitehall, up to Trafalgar Square, across that to St. Martin's Lane. It went neither fast nor slow, and yet it went as fast as anything else went. It moved without sound, except for the clop-clop, across a world that stank of gasoline fumes and charred oil, that shrilled with whistles and hooted with horns, and nobody seemed to notice it, and nothing seemed to get in its way. That was rather amazing, Mr. Sutton Cornish thought. But after all, a hansom cab had nothing to do with that world. It was a ghost, an underlayer of time, the first writing on a palimpsest, brought out by ultraviolet light in a darkened room. "You know," he said, speaking to the horse's rump, because there wasn't anything else there to speak to, "things might happen to a man if a man would just let them happen." The long whip flicked by Prince's ear as lightly as a trout fly flicking at a small dark pool under a rock. "They already have," he added glumly. The cab slowed along a curb, and the trap snapped open again. "Well, here we are, governor. How about one of them little French dinners for 18 pence? You know, governor, 6 courses of nothing at all. You have one on me, and then I have one on you, and we're still hungry. How about it?" A very chill hand clutched at Mr. Sutton Cornish's heart. 6-course dinners for 18 pence? A hansom cab driver who said, "What war, governor?" 20 years ago, perhaps. "Let me out here," he said shrilly. He threw the doors open, thrust money up at the face in the trap, hopped over the wheel to the sidewalk. He didn't quite run, but he walked pretty fast and close to a dark wall and a little slinkingly. But nothing followed him, not even the clop-clop of the horse's hoofs. He swung around a corner into a narrow, crowded street. The light came from the open door of a shop. Curios and Antiques, it said on the facade, in letters once gold, heavily Gothic in style. There was a flare on the sidewalk to attract attention, and by this light he read the sign. The voice came from inside, from a little plump man standing on a box who chanted over the heads of a listless crowd of silent, bored, foreign-looking men. The chanting voice held a note of exhaustion and futility. "Now what am I bid, gents? Now what am I bid on this magnificent example of Oriental art? £1 starts the ball rolling, gents. £1 note coin of the realm. Now who says £1, gents? Who says £1? Nobody said anything. The little plump man on the box shook his head, wiped his face with a dirty handkerchief, and drew a long breath. Then he saw Mr. Sutton Cornish standing on the fringe of the little crowd. "How about you, sir?" he pounced. "You look as if you'd a country house. Now that door's made for a country house. How about you, sir? Just give me a start, like." Mr. Sutton Cornish blinked at him. "Eh? What's that?" he snapped. The listless men smiled faintly and spoke among themselves without moving their thick lips. "No offense, sir," the auctioneer chirped. "If you did 'ave a country 'ouse, that there door might be just what you could use." Mr. Sutton Cornish turned his head slowly, following the auctioneer's pointing hand, and looked for the first time at the bronze door. Chapter 3. It stood all by itself over against the left-hand wall of the nearly stripped shop. It stood about 2 feet out from the side wall, on its own base. It was a double door, apparently of cast bronze, although from its size that seemed impossible. It was heavily scrolled over with a welter of Arabic script in relief, an endless story that here found no listener, a procession of curves and dots that might have expressed anything from an anthology of the Koran to the by-laws of a well-organized harem. The 2 leaves of the door were only part of the thing. It had a wide, heavy base below and a superstructure topped by a Moorish arch. From the meeting edge of the 2 leaves a huge key stuck out of a huge keyhole, the sort of key a medieval jailer used to wear in enormous clanking bunches on a leather belt around his waist. A key from the yeoman of the guard, a comic opera key. "Oh, that," Mr. Sutton Cornish said in the stillness. "Well, really, you know. I'm afraid not that, you know." The auctioneer sighed. No hope had ever been smaller, probably, but at least it was worth a sigh. Then he picked up something which might have been carved ivory but wasn't, stared at it pessimistically, and burst out again. "Now here, gents, I 'old in my and one of the finest examples." Mr. Sutton Cornish smiled faintly and skimmed along the cluster of men until he came close to the bronze door. He stood in front of it, leaning on his stick, which was a section of polished rhinoceros hide over a steel core, dull mahogany in color, and a stick even a heavy man could have leaned on. After a while he reached forward idly and twisted the great key. It turned stubbornly, but it turned. A ring beside it was the doorknob. He twisted that too, and tugged one half of the door open. He straightened, and with a pleasantly idle gesture thrust his stick forward through the opening. And then, for the second time that evening, something incredible happened to him. He wheeled sharply. Nobody was paying any attention. The auction was dead on its feet. The silent men were drifting out into the night. In a pause, hammering sounded at the back of the shop. The plump little auctioneer looked more and more as if he were eating a bad egg. Mr. Sutton Cornish looked down at his gloved right hand. There was no stick in it. There was nothing in it. He stepped to one side and looked behind the door. There was no stick there on the dusty floor. He had felt nothing. Nothing had jerked at him. The stick had merely passed part way through the door, and then it had merely ceased to exist. He leaned down and picked up a piece of torn paper, wadded it swiftly into a ball, glanced behind him again, and tossed the ball through the open part of the door. Then he let out a slow sigh in which some Neolithic rapture struggled with his civilized amazement. The ball of paper didn't fall to the floor behind the door. It fell in midair, clean out of the visible world. Mr. Sutton Cornish reached his empty right hand forward and very slowly and carefully pushed the door shut. Then he just stood there and licked his lips. After a while, "Harem door," he said very softly. "Exit door of a harem. Now that's an idea." A very charming idea, too. The silken lady, her night of pleasure with the Sultan over, would be conducted politely to that door and would casually step through it. Then nothing. No sobbing in the night, no broken hearts, no blackamoor with cruel eyes and a large scimitar, no knotted silk cord, no blood, no dull splash in the midnight Bosphorus, merely nothing. A cool, clean, perfectly timed, and perfectly irrevocable absence of existence. Someone would close the door and lock it and take the key out, and for the time being that would be that. Mr. Sutton Cornish didn't notice the emptying of the shop. Faintly he heard its street door close, but without giving it any meaning. The hammering at the back stopped for a moment, voices spoke. Then steps came near. They were weary steps in the silence, the steps of a man who had had enough of that day, and of many such days. A voice spoke at Mr. Sutton Cornish's elbow, an end-of-the-day voice. "A very fine piece of work, sir. A bit out of my line, to be frank with you." Mr. Sutton Cornish didn't look at him, not yet. "Quite a bit out of anybody's line," he said gravely. "I see it interests you, sir, after all." Mr. Sutton Cornish turned his head slowly. Down on the floor, off his box, the auctioneer was a mere wisp of a man. A shabby, unpressed, red-eyed little man who had found life no picnic. "Yes, but what would one do with it?" Mr. Sutton Cornish asked throatily. "Well, it's a door like any other, sir. Bit heavy, bit queer-like, but still a door like any other." "I wonder," Mr. Sutton Cornish said, still throatily. The auctioneer gave him a swift appraising glance, shrugged and gave it up. He sat down on an empty box, lit a cigarette and relaxed sloppily into private life. "What are you asking for it?" Mr. Sutton Cornish inquired quite suddenly. "What are you asking for it, Mr. Skimp, sir? Josiah Skimp." "Well, a 20-pound note, sir? Bronze alone ought to be worth that for artwork." The little man's eyes were glittering again. Mr. Sutton Cornish nodded absently. "I don't know much about that," he said. "'Ell of a lot of it, sir." Mr. Skimp hopped off his box, padded over and heaved the leaf of the door open, grunting. "Beats me how it ever got here. For 7-footers. No door for shrimps like me. Look, sir." Mr. Sutton Cornish had a rather ghastly presentiment, of course, but he didn't do anything about it. He couldn't. His tongue stuck in his throat and his legs were like ice. The comical contrast between the massiveness of the door and his own wisp of a body seemed to amuse Mr. Skimp. His little round face threw back the shadow of a grin. Then he lifted his foot and hopped. Mr. Sutton Cornish watched him, as long as there was anything to watch. In fact, he watched much longer. The hammering at the back of the shop seemed to get quite thunderous in the silence. Once more, after a long time, Mr. Sutton Cornish bent forward and closed the door. This time he twisted the key and dragged it out and put it in his overcoat pocket. "Got to do something," he mumbled. "Got to do. Can't let this sort of thing." His voice trailed off and then he jerked violently as though a sharp pain had shot through him. Then he laughed out loud off-key. Not a natural laugh. Not a very nice laugh. "That was beastly," he said under his breath, "but amazingly funny." He was still standing there rooted when a pale young man with a hammer appeared at his elbow. "Mr. Skimp, step out, sir, or did you notice? We're supposed to be closed up, sir." Mr. Sutton Cornish didn't look up at the pale young man with the hammer. Moving a clammy tongue, he said, "Yes, Mr. Skimp stepped out." The young man started to turn away. Mr. Sutton Cornish made a gesture. "I've bought this door from Mr. Skimp," he said. £20. Will you take the money and my card?" The pale young man beamed, delighted at personal contact with a sale. Mr. Sutton Cornish drew out a note case, extracted 4 5-pound notes from it, also a formal calling card. He wrote on the card with a small gold pencil. His hand seemed surprisingly steady. "No, 14 Grinling Crescent," he said. "Have it sent tomorrow without fail. It's very heavy. I shall pay the drayage, of course. Mr. Skimp will." His voice trailed off again. "Mr. Skimp wouldn't." "Oh, that's all right, sir. Mr. Skimp is my uncle." "Ah, that's too. I mean, well, take this 10-shilling note for yourself, won't you?" Mr. Sutton Cornish left the shop rather rapidly, his right hand clutching the big key down in his pocket. An ordinary taxi took him home to dinner. He dined alone after 3 whiskeys. But he wasn't as much alone as he looked. He never would be anymore. Chapter 4. It came the next day, swathed in sacking and bound about with cords, looking like nothing on earth and conducting itself with rather less agility than a concert grand. 4 large men in leather aprons perspired it up the forefront steps and into the hall, with a good deal of sharp language back and forth. They had a light hoist to help them get it off their dray, but the steps almost beat them. Once inside the hall they got it on 2 dollies, and after that it was just an average heavy grunting job. They set it up at the back of Mr. Sutton Cornish's study, across a sort of alcove he had an idea about. He tipped them liberally, they went away, and Collins, the butler, left the front door open for a while to air the place through. Carpenters came. The sacking was stripped off, and a framework was built around the door so that it became part of a partition wall across the alcove. A small door was set in the partition. When the work was done and the mess cleared up, Mr. Sutton Cornish asked for an oil can and locked himself into his study. Then and only then he got out the big bronze key and fitted it again into the huge lock and opened the bronze door wide, both sides of it. He oiled the hinges from the rear, just in case. Then he shut it again and oiled the lock, removed the key and went for a good long walk in Kensington Gardens and back. Collins and the first parlour-maid had a look at it while he was out. Cook hadn't been upstairs yet. "Beats me what the old fool's after," the butler said stonily. "I give him another week, Bruggs. If she's not back by then, I give him my notice. How about you, Bruggs?" "Let him have his fun," Bruggs said, tossing her head. "That old sow he's married to? Bruggs! Tit-tat to you, Mr. Collins," Bruggs said, and flounced out of the room. Mr. Collins remained long enough to sample the whiskey in the big square decanter on Mr. Sutton Cornish's smoking table. In a shallow, tall cabinet in the alcove behind the bronze door, Mr. Sutton Cornish arranged a few odds and ends of old china, and bric-a-brac and carved ivory, and some idols in shiny black wood, very old and unnecessary. It wasn't much of an excuse for so massive a door. He added 3 statuettes in pink marble. The alcove still had an air of not being quite onto itself. Naturally, the bronze door was never open unless the room door was locked. In the morning Bruggs, or Mary the housemaid, dusted in the alcove, having entered, of course, by the partition door. That amused Mr. Sutton Cornish slightly, but the amusement began to wear thin. It was about 3 weeks after his wife and Teddy left that something happened to brighten him up. A large, tawny man with a waxed mustache and steady gray eyes called on him and presented a card that indicated he was Detective Sergeant Thomas Lloyd of Scotland Yard. He said that one Josiah Skimp, an auctioneer living in Kennington, was missing from his home to the great concern of his family, and that his nephew, one George William Hawkins, also of Kennington, had happened to mention that Mr. Sutton Cornish was present in a shop in Soho on the very night when Mr. Skimp vanished. In fact, Mr. Sutton Cornish might even have been the last person known to have spoken to Mr. Skimp. Mr. Sutton Cornish laid out the whiskey and cigars, placed his fingertips together and nodded gravely. "I recall him perfectly, Sergeant. In fact, I bought that funny door over there from him. Quaint, isn't it?" The detective glanced at the bronze door, a brief and empty glance. "Out of my line, sir, I'm afraid. I do recall now something was said about the door. They had quite a job moving it. Very smooth whiskey, sir. Very smooth indeed. Help yourself, Sergeant. So Mr. Skimp has run off and lost himself. Sorry I can't help you. I really didn't know him, you know." The detective nodded his large, tawny head. "I didn't think you did, sir. The Yard only got the case a couple of days ago. Routine call, you know. Did he seem excited, for instance?" "He seemed tired," Mr. Sutton Cornish mused. "Very fed up with the whole business of auctioneering, perhaps. I only spoke to him a moment. About that door, you know. A nice little man, but tired." The detective didn't bother to look at the door again. He finished his whiskey and allowed himself a little more. "No family trouble," he said. "Not much money, but who has these days? No scandal. Not a melancholy type, they say. Odd." "Some very queer types in Soho," Mr. Sutton Cornish said mildly. The detective thought it over. "Harmless, though. A rough district once, but not in our time. Might I ask you what you was doing over there, sir?" "Wandering," Mr. Sutton Cornish said. "Just wandering. A little more of this?" "Well, now really, sir, 3 whiskeys in a morning. Well, just this once, and many thanks to you, sir." Detective Sergeant Lloyd left, rather regretfully. After he had been gone 10 minutes or so, Mr. Sutton Cornish got up and locked the study door. He walked softly down the long, narrow room and got the big bronze key out of his inside breast pocket, where he always carried it now. The door opened noiselessly and easily now. It was well balanced for its weight. He opened it wide, both sides of it. "Mr. Skimp," he said very gently into the emptiness, "you are wanted by the police, Mr. Skimp." The fun of that lasted him well on to lunchtime. Chapter 5. In the afternoon, Mrs. Sutton Cornish came back. She appeared quite suddenly before him in the study, sniffed harshly at the smell of tobacco and scotch, refused a chair, and stood very solid and lowering just inside the closed door. Teddy stood beside her for a moment, then hurled himself at the edge of the rug. "Stop that, you little beast! Stop that at once, darling," Mrs. Sutton Cornish said. She picked Teddy up and stroked him. He lay in her arms and licked her nose and sneered at Mr. Sutton Cornish. "I find," Mrs. Sutton Cornish said, in a voice that had the brittleness of dry suet, "after numerous very boring interviews with my solicitor, that I can do nothing without your help. Naturally, I dislike asking for that." Mr. Sutton Cornish made ineffectual motions towards a chair, and when they were ignored, he leaned resignedly against the mantelpiece. He said he supposed that was so. "Perhaps it has escaped your attention that I am still comparatively a young woman. And these are modern days, James." Mr. Sutton Cornish smiled wanly and glanced at the bronze door. She hadn't noticed it yet. Then he put his head on one side and wrinkled his nose and said mildly, without much interest, "You're thinking of a divorce?" "I'm thinking of very little else," she said brutally. "And you wish me to compromise myself in the usual manner, at Brighton, with a lady who will be described in court as an actress?" She glared at him. Teddy helped her glare. Their combined glare failed even to perturb Mr. Sutton Cornish. He had other resources now. "Not with that dog," he said carelessly when she didn't answer. She made some kind of furious noise, a snort with a touch of snarl in it. She sat down then, very slowly and heavily, a little puzzled. She let Teddy jump to the floor. "Just what are you talking about, James?" she asked witheringly. He strolled over to the bronze door, leaned his back against it, and explored its rich protuberances with a fingertip. Even then she didn't see the door. "You want a divorce, my dear Luella," he said slowly, "so that you may marry another man. There's absolutely no point in it with that dog. I shouldn't be asked to humiliate myself. Too useless. No man would marry that dog." "James, are you attempting to blackmail me?" Her voice was rather dreadful. She almost bugled. Teddy sneaked across to the window curtains and pretended to lie down. "And even if he would," Mr. Sutton Cornish said with a peculiar quiet in his tone, "I oughtn't to make it possible. I ought to have enough human compassion. James, how dare you? You make me physically sick with your insincerity." For the first time in his life, James Sutton Cornish laughed in his wife's face. "Those are 2 or 3 of the silliest speeches I ever had to listen to," he said. "You're an elderly, ponderous, and damned dull woman. Go out and buy yourself a gigolo, if you want someone to fawn on you. But don't ask me to make a beast of myself so that he can marry you and throw me out of my father's house. Now run along and take your miserable brown beetle with you." She got up quickly, very quickly for her, and stood a moment almost swaying. Her eyes were as blank as a blind man's eyes. In the silence, Teddy tore fretfully at a curtain, with bitter, preoccupied growls that neither of them noticed. She said very slowly and almost gently, "We'll see how long you stay in your father's house. James Sutton Cornish, pauper." She moved very quickly the short distance to the door, went through and slammed it behind her. The slamming of the door, an unusual event in that household, seemed to awaken a lot of echoes that had not been called upon to perform for a long time, so that Mr. Sutton Cornish was not instantly aware of the small peculiar sound at his own side of the door, a mixture of sniffing and whimpering, with just a dash of growl. Teddy. Teddy hadn't made the door. The sudden, bitter exit had for once caught him napping. Teddy was shut in with Mr. Sutton Cornish. For a little while, Mr. Sutton Cornish watched him rather absently, still shaken by the interview, not fully realizing what had happened. The small, wet black snout explored the crack at the bottom of the closed door. At moments, while the whimpering and sniffing went on, Teddy turned a reddish-brown outjutting eye, like a fat, wet marble, toward the man he hated. Mr. Sutton Cornish snapped out of it rather suddenly. He straightened and beamed. "Well, well, old man," he purred. "Here we are, and for once without the ladies." Cunning dawned in his beaming eye. Teddy read it and slipped off under a chair. He was silent now, very silent. And Mr. Sutton Cornish was silent as he moved swiftly along the wall and turned the key in the study door. Then he sped back toward the alcove, dug the key of the bronze door out of his pocket, unlocked, and opened that, wide. He sauntered back toward Teddy, beyond Teddy, as far as the window. He grinned at Teddy. "Here we are, old man. Jolly, eh? Have a shot of whiskey, old man?" Teddy made a small sound under the chair, and Mr. Sutton Cornish sidled toward him delicately, bent down suddenly, and lunged. Teddy made another chair farther up the room. He breathed hard, and his eyes stuck out rounder and wetter than ever, but he was silent except for his breathing. And Mr. Sutton Cornish, stalking him patiently from chair to chair, was as silent as the last leaf of autumn falling in slow eddies in a windless copse. At about that time the doorknob turned sharply. Mr. Sutton Cornish paused to smile and click his tongue. A sharp knock followed. He ignored it. The knocking went on sharper and sharper, and an angry voice accompanied it. Mr. Sutton Cornish went on stalking Teddy. Teddy did the best he could, but the room was narrow, and Mr. Sutton Cornish was patient and rather agile when he wanted to be. In the interests of agility, he was quite willing to be undignified. The knocking and calling out beyond the door went on, but inside the room things could only end one way. Teddy reached the sill of the bronze door, sniffed at it rapidly, almost lifted a contemptuous hind leg, but didn't because Mr. Sutton Cornish was too close to him. He sent a low snarl back over his shoulder and hopped that disastrous sill. Mr. Sutton Cornish raced back to the room door, turned the key swiftly and silently, crept over to a chair and sprawled in it laughing. He was still laughing when Mrs. Sutton Cornish thought to try the knob again, found the door yielded this time, and stormed into the room. Through the mist of his grisly, solitary laughter, he saw her cold stare. Then he heard her rustling about the room, heard her calling Teddy then. "What's that thing?" He heard her snap suddenly. "What utter foolishness, Teddy! Come, mother's little lamb! Come, Teddy!" Even in his laughter, Mr. Sutton Cornish felt the wing of a regret brush his cheek. Poor little Teddy. He stopped laughing and sat up, stiff and alert. The room was too quiet. "Luella!" he called sharply. No sound answered him. He closed his eyes, gulped, opened them again, crept along the room staring. He stood in front of his little alcove for a long time, peering through that bronze portal at the innocent little collection of trivia beyond. He locked the door with quivering hands, stuffed the key down in his pocket, poured himself a stiff peg of whiskey. A ghostly voice that sounded something like his own, and yet unlike it, said out loud, very close to his ear, "I didn't really intend anything like that. Never, never, oh never, or." After a long pause, "Did I?" Braced by the scotch, he sneaked out into the hall and out of the front door without Collins seeing him. No car waited outside. As luck would have it, she had evidently come up from Chinverley by train and taken a taxi. Of course they could trace the taxi later on when they tried. A lot of good that would do them. Collins was next. He thought about Collins for some time, glancing at the bronze door, tempted a good deal but finally shaking his head negatively. "Not that way," he muttered. "Have to draw the line somewhere. Can't have a procession." He drank some more whiskey and rang the bell. Collins made it rather easy for him. "You rang, sir? What did it sound like?" Mr. Sutton Cornish asked, a little thick-tongued. "Canaries?" Collins' chin snapped back a full 2 inches. "The Dowager won't be here to dinner, Collins. I think I'll dine out, that's all." Collins stared at him. A grayness spread over Collins's face, with a little flush at the cheekbones. "You allude to Mrs. Sutton Cornish, sir?" Mr. Sutton Cornish hiccuped. "Who do you suppose?" Gone back to Chinverley to stew in her own juice some more. Ought to be plenty of it." With deadly politeness, Collins said, "I had meant to ask you, sir, whether Mrs. Sutton Cornish would return here, permanently. Otherwise—" "Carry on." Another hiccup. "Otherwise I should not care to remain myself, sir."
Mr. Sutton Cornish stood up and went close to Collins and breathed in his face.
Haig and Haig, a good breath of the type. "Get out," he rasped. "Get out now. Upstairs with you and pack your things. Your check will be ready for you. A full month. £32 in all, I believe?" Collins stepped back and moved towards the door. "That will suit me perfectly, sir. £32 is the correct amount." He reached the door, spoke again before he opened it. "A reference from you, sir, will not be desired." He went out, closing the door softly. "Ha!" Mr. Sutton Cornish said. Then he grinned slyly, stopped pretending to be angry or drunk, and sat down to write the check. He dined out that night, and the next night, and the next. Cook left on the third day, taking the kitchen maid with her. That left Bruggs and Mary, the housemaid. On the fifth day, Bruggs wept when she gave her notice. "I'd rather go at once, sir, if you'll let me," she sobbed. "There's something creepy-like about the house since Cook and Mr. Collins and Teddy and Mrs. Sutton Cornish left." Mr. Sutton Cornish patted her arm. "Cook and Mr. Collins and Teddy and Mrs. Sutton Cornish," he repeated. If only she could hear that order of precedence. Bruggs stared at him, red-eyed. He patted her arm again. "Quite all right, Bruggs. I'll give you your month. And tell Mary to go too. Think I'll close the house up and live in the south of France for a while. Now don't cry, Bruggs." "No, sir." She bawled her way out of the room. He didn't get to the south of France, of course. Too much fun being right where he was, alone at last in the home of his fathers. Not quite what they would have approved of, perhaps, except possibly the general. But the best he could do. Almost overnight, the house began to have the murmurs of an empty place. He kept the windows closed and the shades down. That seemed to be a gesture of respect he could hardly afford to omit. Chapter 6. Scotland Yard moves with the deadly dependability of a glacier, and at times almost as slowly. So it was a full month and 9 days before Detective Sergeant Lloyd came back to number 14 Grinling Crescent. By that time the front steps had long since lost their white serenity. The apple-green door had acquired a sinister shade of gray. The brass saucer around the bell, the knocker, the big latch, all these were tarnished and stained, like the brass work of an old freighter limping around the horn. Those who rang the bell departed slowly, with backward glances, and Mr. Sutton Cornish would be peeping out at them from the side of a drawn window shade. He concocted himself weird meals in the echoing kitchen, creeping in after dark with ragged-looking parcels of food. Later he would slink out again with his hat pulled low and his overcoat collar up, give a quick glance up and down the street, then scramble off around the corner. The police constable on duty saw him occasionally at these maneuvers and rubbed his chin a good deal over the situation. No longer a study even in withered elegance, Mr. Sutton Cornish became a customer in obscure eating houses where draymen blew on their soup on naked tables in compartments like horse stalls. In foreign cafes where men with blue-black hair and pointed shoes dined interminably over minute bottles of wine. In crowded, anonymous tea shops where the food looked and tasted as tired as the people who ate it. He was no longer a perfectly sane man. In his dry, solitary, poisoned laughter, there was the sound of crumbling walls. Even the pinched loafers under the arches of the Thames embankment, who listened to him because he had sixpences, even these were glad when he passed on, stepping carefully in unshined shoes and lightly swinging the stick he no longer carried. Then, late one night, returning softly out of the dull gray darkness, he found the man from Scotland Yard lurking near the dirty front steps with an air of thinking himself hidden behind the lamp-post. "I'd like a few words with you, sir," he said, stepping forth briskly and holding his hands as though he might have to use them suddenly. "Charmed, I'm sure," Mr. Sutton Cornish chuckled. "Trot right in." He opened the door with his latchkey, switched the light on, and stepped with accustomed ease over a pile of dusty letters on the floor. "Got rid of the servants," he explained to the detective. "Always did want to be alone someday." The carpet was covered with burned matches, pipe ash, torn paper, and the corners of the hall had cobwebs in them. Mr. Sutton Cornish opened his study door, switched the light on in there, and stood aside. The detective passed him warily, staring hard at the condition of the house. Mr. Sutton Cornish pushed him into a dusty chair, thrust a cigar at him, reached for the whiskey decanter. "Business or pleasure this time?" he inquired archly. Detective Sergeant Lloyd held his hard hat on one knee and looked the cigar over dubiously. "Smoke it later, thank you, sir." "Business, I take it." "I'm instructed to make inquiries as to the whereabouts of Mrs. Sutton Cornish." Mr. Sutton Cornish sipped whiskey amiably and pointed at the decanter. He took his whiskey straight now. "Haven't the least idea," he said. "Why? Down at Chinverley, I suppose. Country place. She owns it." "It so 'appens she ain't," Detective Sergeant Lloyd said, slipping on an H, which he seldom did any more. "Been a separation, I'm told," he added grimly. "That's our business, old man." "Up to a point, yes, sir. Granted. Not after her solicitor can't find her and she ain't anywhere anybody can find her. Not then. It ain't just your business." Mr. Sutton Cornish thought it over. "You might have something there, as the Americans say," he conceded. The detective passed a large pale hand across his forehead and leaned forward. "Let's have it, sir," he said quietly. "Best in the long run, best for all. Nothing to gain by foolishness. The law's the law." "Have some whiskey," Mr. Sutton Cornish said. "Not tonight, I won't," Detective Sergeant Lloyd said grimly. "She left me," Mr. Sutton Cornish shrugged, "and because of that the servants left me. You know what servants are nowadays. Beyond that I haven't an idea." "Oh, use I think you have," the detective said, losing a little more of his West End manner. "No charges have been preferred, but I think you know all right, all right." Mr. Sutton Cornish smiled airily. The detective scowled at him and went on. "We've taken the liberty of watching you, and for a gentleman of your position you've been living a damn queer life, if I may say so." "You may say so, and then you may get to hell out of my house," Mr. Sutton Cornish said suddenly. "Not so fast. Not yet, I won't. Perhaps you would like to search the house. Perhaps I should. Perhaps I shall. No hurry there. Takes time. Sometimes takes shovels." Detective Sergeant Lloyd permitted himself to leer rather nastily. "Seems to me like people does a bit of disappearin' when you 'appen to be around. Take that skimp. Now take Mrs. Sutton Cornish." Mr. Sutton Cornish stared at him with lingering malice. "And in your experience, Sergeant, where do people go when they disappear?" "Sometimes they don't disappear. Sometimes somebody disappears them." The detective licked his strong lips with a slightly cat-like expression. Mr. Sutton Cornish slowly raised his arm and pointed to the bronze door. "You wanted it, Sergeant," he said suavely. "You shall have it. There is where you should look for Mr. Skimp, for Teddy the Pomeranian, and for my wife. There, behind that ancient door of bronze." The detective didn't shift his gaze. For a long moment he didn't change expression. Then, quite amiably, he grinned. There was something else behind his eyes, but it was behind them. "Let's you and me take a nice little walk," he said breezily. "The fresh air would do you a lot of good, sir. Let's—" "There," Mr. Sutton Cornish announced, still pointing with his arm rigid. "Behind that door. Ah. Detective Sergeant Lloyd waggled a large finger roguishly. "Been alone too much, you 'ave, sir. Thinkin' about things. Do it myself once in a while. Gets a fellow balmy in the crumpet like. Take a nice little walk with me, sir. We could stop somewhere for a nice—" The big tawny man planted a forefinger on the end of his nose and pushed his head back and wiggled his little finger in the air at the same time. But his steady gray eyes remained in another mood. "We'll look at my bronze door first." Mr. Sutton Cornish skipped out of his chair. The detective had him by the arm in a flash. "None of that," he said in a frosty voice. "Hold still, you." "Key in here," Mr. Sutton Cornish said, pointing at his breast pocket, but not trying to get his hand into it. The detective got it out for him, stared at it heavily. "All behind the door on meathhooks," Mr. Sutton Cornish said. "All three. Little meathook for Teddy. Very large meathook for my wife. Very large meathook." Holding him with his left hand, Detective Sergeant Lloyd thought it over. His pale brows were drawn tight. His large, weathered face was grim but skeptical. "No harm to look," he said finally. He marched Mr. Sutton Cornish across the floor, pushed the bronze key into the huge antique lock, twisted the ring, and opened the door. He opened both sides of it. He stood looking into that very innocent alcove with its cabinet of knickknacks and absolutely nothing else. He became genial again. "Meat-hooks, did you say, sir? Very cute, if I may say so." He laughed, released Mr. Sutton Cornish's arm, and teetered on his heels. "What the hell's it for?" he asked. Mr. Sutton Cornish doubled over very swiftly and launched his thin body with furious speed at the big detective. "Take a little walk yourself, and find out," he screamed. Detective Sergeant Lloyd was a big and solid man and probably used to being butted. Mr. Sutton Cornish could hardly have moved him 6 inches, even with a running start. But the bronze door had a high sill. The detective moved with the deceptive quickness of his trade, swayed his body just enough, and jarred his foot against the bronze sill. If it hadn't been for that, he would have plucked Mr. Sutton Cornish neatly out of the air and held him squirming like a kitten between his large thumb and forefinger. But the sill jarred him off balance. He stumbled a little and swayed his body completely out of Mr. Sutton Cornish's way. Mr. Sutton Cornish butted empty space, the empty space framed by that majestic door of bronze. He sprawled forward, clutching across the sill. Detective Sergeant Lloyd straightened up slowly, twisted his thick neck, and stared. He moved back a little from the sill so that he could be perfectly certain the side of the door hid nothing from him. It didn't. He saw a cabinet of odd pieces of china, odds and ends of carved ivory and shiny black wood, and on top of the cabinet 3 little statuettes of pink marble. He saw nothing else. There was nothing else in there to see. "Gorblimey," he said at last, violently. At least he thought he said it. Somebody said it. He wasn't quite sure. He was never absolutely sure about anything after that night. Chapter 7. The whiskey looked all right. It smelled all right, too. Shaking so that he could hardly hold the decanter, Detective Sergeant Lloyd poured a little into a glass and took a sip in his dry mouth and waited. After a little while, he drank another spoonful. He waited again. Then he drank a stiff drink, a very stiff drink. He sat down in the chair beside the whiskey and took his large folded cotton handkerchief out of his pocket and unfolded it slowly and mopped his face and neck and behind his ears. In a little while, he wasn't shaking quite so much. Warmth began to flow through him. He stood up, drank some more whiskey, then slowly and bitterly moved back down the room. He swung the bronze door shut, locked it, put the key down in his own pocket. He opened the partition door at the side, braced himself, and stepped through into the alcove. He looked at the back of the bronze door. He touched it. It wasn't very light in there, but he could see that the place was empty, except for the silly-looking cabinet. He came out again, shaking his head. "Can't be," he said out loud. "Not a chance. Not 'arf a chance." Then, with the sudden unreasonableness of the reasonable man, he flew into a rage. "If I get ooked for this," he said between his teeth, "I get ooked." He went down to the dark cellar, rummaged around until he found a hand axe and carried it back upstairs. He hacked the woodwork to ribbons. When he was done, the bronze door stood alone on its base, jagged wood all around it, but not holding it any longer. Detective Sergeant Lloyd put the hand axe down, wiped his hands and face on his big handkerchief, and went in behind the door. He put his shoulder to it and set his strong yellow teeth. Only a brutally determined man of immense strength could have done it. The door fell forward with a heavy rumbling crash that seemed to shake the whole house. The echoes of that crash died away slowly, along infinite corridors of unbelief. Then the house was silent again. The big man went out into the hall and had another look out of the front door. He put his coat on, adjusted his hard hat, folded his damp handkerchief carefully, and put it in his hip pocket, lit the cigar Mr. Sutton Cornish had given him, took a drink of whiskey, and swaggered to the door. At the door he turned and deliberately sneered at the bronze door, lying fallen but still huge in the welter of splintered wood. "To 'ell with you, whoever you are," Detective Sergeant Lloyd said. "I ain't no bloody primrose." He shut the house door behind him. A little high fog outside, a few dim stars, a quiet street with lighted windows. 2 or 3 cars of expensive appearance, very likely chauffeurs lounging in them, but no one in sight. He crossed the street at an angle and walked along beside the tall iron railing of the park. Faintly through the rhododendron bushes he could see the dull glimmer of the little ornamental lake. He looked up and down the street and took the big bronze key out of his pocket. "Make it a good 'un," he told himself softly. His arm swept up and over. There was a minute splash in the ornamental lake, then silence. Detective Sergeant Lloyd walked on calmly, puffing at his cigar back at the CI. He gave his report steadily, and for the first and last time in his life, there was something besides truth in it. Couldn't raise anybody at the house. All dark. Waited 3 hours. Must all be away. The inspector nodded and yawned. The Sutton Cornish heirs eventually pried the estate out of Chancery, and opened up number 14 Grinling Crescent, and found the bronze door lying in a welter of dust and splintered wood and matted cobwebs. They stared at it goggle-eyed, and when they found out what it was, sent for dealers, thinking there might be a little money in it. But the dealers sighed and said no money in that sort of thing now. Better ship it off to a foundry and have it melted down for the metal. Gets so much a pound. The dealers departed noiselessly with wry smiles. Sometimes when things are a little dull in the missing persons section of the CID, they take the Sutton Cornish file out and dust it off and look through it sourly and put it away again. Sometimes when Inspector, formerly Detective Sergeant, Thomas Lloyd is walking along an unusually dark and quiet street, he will whirl suddenly for no reason at all, and jump to one side with a swift, anguished agility, but there isn't really anybody there, trying to butt him. End of The Bronze Door by Raymond Chandler.